So my name is Elena Puchlarauri. I'm one of the directors and co-founders of Build Up. Most of you are probably familiar with Build Up if you've seen this announcement of the webinar. Thanks for joining us today. I'm joined today by Dr. Medinat Malefakis, who is a research and information analyst for West, East, and Southern Africa at ACAP's program hosted by the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you, Medinat, for joining us. Before this position, she was a global postdoctoral researcher at the Berlin Social Science Center, a research fellow with the United States Institute for Peace's Resolve Network, and a junior researcher at the Max Planck Institute in Halle. Her doctorate from NDA and the University of Zurich was in international studies, majoring in terrorism and humanitarian displacement in the Lake Chad Basin of West Africa. Her research interests include terrorism, violent extremism, religious fundamentalism, humanitarian displacement of refugees and IDPs, social and violent conflicts, post-conflict resettlement, rehabilitation, and reintegration. Some of you may know that Medinat is also one of the keynote speakers at Build Peace 2020, which is Build Up's annual conference, which this year we are hosting in collaboration with our partners at the Bertha Center in Cape Town, and it will be an event that is run in parallel physically in Cape Town, if that's possible, given the current circumstances, and also virtually online. So whether you're able to be physically in Cape Town or you can join us remotely, you'll be able to hear Medinat's keynote in November. And on that keynote, Medinat will be talking about recurring trends in the identity polarization of northern and southern Nigeria. But we don't want her to do the keynote right now because that would be giving it away. The keynote that she's going to give is actually part of one of the sub-themes of the conference, which is on identity polarization. And in that sub-theme, we're asking how digital technologies are influencing the formation and deconstructions of identities and identity-based conflict. And we're especially interested in understanding how the pandemic has interacted with identity polarization online. So at Build Up, we've started to do some thinking on this. And what we thought we'd do in this webinar is that I will share some of the reflections that we're coming to as a team at Build Up as we go through our work on identity polarization. We're running a number of programs that are related to this issue in 3 areas, and I'll explain what those 3 areas are in a minute. Now, I'd just like to say that these are reflections. They're not final results. We're not an academic research institution, and we're not claiming this is sort of an absolute view of how identity polarization happens online. But I do think that they're interesting, and we're still figuring it out. And so at the end of each one of these 3 areas, I will stop and I'll ask Medinat to reflect and comment on what we've found so far. And then we'll take one question from the audience before moving on to the next area of discussion. So if, as you're listening to anything that I say or Medinat says, at any point you have a question, please make sure to submit it. Julie, you're going to have to help me here. I think they submit it through the Q&A function in Zoom. Is that correct? Yes. Julie's saying yes. So that's what you do. You submit it through the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will select one question from there. So that's how we're going to run this webinar. And so I'm going to start with sharing a little bit about what we are seeing about how divisive and common identities are expressed online. And I'm actually going to share my screen and share some slides that have some of the summary findings of what we found. So you should all be seeing my screen now, I hope. Okay. And so I'm going to start, as I said, with this idea of expressions of divisive identities and of common identities. That's the first area I'm going to be sharing and asking Medinat to reflect on. Then I'll move on to talking about the links between online identity expressions and offline action, and asking Medinat what she thinks about that from her research and experience. And then finally, we'll be talking briefly about the features of social media platforms that may impact the formation of identity online. So the first thing that I wanted to share is this idea of how divisive identities are being expressed online, and particularly on social media, right? And this is based largely on a consultation we ran as part of the Stockholm Forum on Facebook and the way that identity was expressed on social media. And what we found are these four main points. So the first thing we noticed is that by far the most common way to express divisive identities is to dismiss an opinion or a position through mockery, or alternatively to dismiss it as a position of privilege. We also saw that fake news shows up quite often in the expression of divisive identities, often to accuse a group of a behavior or associate them with a negative identity marker, but based on something that is fake. Then, of course, another common way of expressing divisive identities is through hate speech and dangerous speech, although it was far less common than you might perhaps think. So hate speech and dangerous speech are spoken of a lot as a problem on social media. We see that as just the tip of the iceberg in this whole realm of divisive identities. Common forms of hate speech and dangerous speech included stereotyping a group, dehumanizing a group, direct requests to exclude a group, and of course, direct threats of violence to a group. And then finally, the other way that we saw that divisive identities were being shared online was related to the way that conversations unfold on social media, and how that can contribute to deepening divisions about identities. We observed escalation in a common thread that leads to extreme positions. So the way those common threads are structured. And it's also quite common to simplify a position as a way of shutting down dialogue. So those were our four main findings on divisive identity so far. When it comes to expressing common identities online, we found three things. I think the first two are quite obvious in a way. So people try to find common ground on social media by expressing common identity markers, or by identifying common experiences or sharing acts of solidarity. And there's also quite a lot of just straight up positive messaging. So there's an example on this slide, just straight up kind of messages of positivity or of support to a group. The third point that we found on common identities is maybe less obvious, which is that there are some instances where people look to find commonality by complicating the narrative in social media. So by nuancing a position or by pointing out that what might seem a minority experience actually affects us all. And we thought that was quite interesting, and we hadn't seen that expressed as much in the past. So that's a quick fire of what we found so far on divisive identities and common identities. And I'd now like to pass it on to Medinat, who's really the expert on this, to tell us what she thinks of those findings and what she's seen from her experience.
Thank you very much, Elena, for the introduction and for having me on this webinar. Before I go on to respond to you, I would like to say that the examples that I'm going to be bringing are direct responses to what Europe has found out about how identity, polarization of identity, and also the digital technologies all correlate. And I would be using specific examples from the Nigerian context here. And like she said, this is part of what the keynote is going to be, remember, and I'm going to try to not say too much, to reveal too much about what the keynote is going to be. So I'm just going to be very brief on the specific examples that I'm going to be bringing in response to Elena's and Budop's findings. Before I go on to that, I would want to give an introductory context into the identity landscape in Nigeria. Very unlike in other countries, but also similar in some other countries, identity formation in Nigeria is a very complex web. It involves a lot of layering of divisions and subdivisions. Sometimes these divisions are intertwined so tightly. Sometimes they are so loosely intertwined that it becomes very difficult to be able to keep tab of where somebody's identity starts and where it ends. And this complex web is also how polarization of identities in Nigeria, it's how it forms. For instance, the most important or most popular markers of identity in Nigeria is religion and ethnicity. These are the biggest. But apart from these two, there are other very important identity markers. For example, we have a vibrant class identity spectrum in Nigeria. We have a very resonating gender identity. We have identity by political participation. We also have identity by age, because in Nigeria, the gerontocratic social structure is very, very strong. While this might be the broadest identity markers, each of these have sub-identity markers under them. And this is why it is such a complex layer of identity markers. For example, ethnically, there may be the most popular language or linguistic groups, that is Hausa, Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo. But under these three most popular groups, there are over 350 different ethnic groups, and there are over 500 different languages that are spoken under these three broad ethnic markers. And so, because also people identify themselves more with this sub-ethnic groups that they belong to, this is a different layer of identity marking. Christianity and Islam are the two biggest religion in Nigeria, and you would assume that it's fairly easy. There's not supposed to be some kind of sub-identity in this, but no, there isn't. For Christianity, for example, people first would, or Christians would first identify themselves either as Anglicans or as Baptists, as Catholics, or as Jehovah's Witnesses first, before they identify themselves as Christians. And Muslims themselves will first of all identify themselves as Sunnis or as Shiites, as members of a Tijaniya group or the Qadiriya group, before they identify themselves with the broadly loose Islamic identity. It is also possible that it's possible that one individual can have a crisscross of all of these identities. Of course, this is the exception rather than the rule, but mostly we see that all of these sub-identities are much more dearer to people than the larger identity markers like ethnicity and religion. And of course, you would ask sometimes, how did Nigeria get here? Why is the country such a motley of identity and sub-identity markers? The first response that people would give to this is that Nigeria before colonialism was an independent mix of people who had their individual cultures and traditions. And colonial legacy left us with a country that was just put together for through artificial borders for the convenience of European colonization. But Nigeria has been independent from colonialism for over about 60 years now. So this justification of identity polarization with colonization does not hold water anymore. And what we're beginning to see much more prominently right now is that the post-colonial governments who inherited power from British colonialists continue to exploit the existence of identity markers in order to achieve vested interests, whether this interests are political, economic, or any other kind of interest. So while a lot of people would want to blame the fact that colonialism made Nigeria the way it is, and our history is the reason why there's a lot of broken down identities, it doesn't justify what we contemporarily have, what's happening in the country. So I would go now directly to answer Elena's first point about how divisive identities are expressed through mockery, especially online. And the example I'm going to be bringing today is about the Me Too movement, which was an international movement, but had a Nigerian version, which was called the Arewa Me Too movement in Nigeria. This happened in February 2019. And it was the first time when females, through social media, were able to express or divulge information about sexual abuse. The conservative and mostly traditional nature of the north of Nigeria, where this movement actually started, made it such a surprise that women would come out to talk about their sexual experiences and even to name and shame the people who might have raped them or harassed them. Of course, the major identity that was expressed in this movement was gender identity. And the big deal about the movement was that the women folk, especially in northern Nigeria, where this movement went online, were not expected, they're not naturally expected to come out to talk up to, they're not, how do I explain this? Their place in the society is more of inside, in the context of women are not expected to be seen in public or heard in public, and their views or whatever kind of experiences that they were going through were not expected to be expressed in public. And when the Me Too movement started, and the Arewa Me Too movement was coined in response to this in northern Nigeria, there was varied kind of responses that showed the gender identity division and how polarized gender identity actually is in the Nigerian context. I will be sharing my screen right now for you to see some of the responses that showed how men basically tried to mock their way out of this movement. They tried to dispose of the movement through mockery in order for people to either not listen to the cries or to listen to what the women folk were saying, and also to dislodge of the conversation. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
Now we're going to.
Okay.
Yes, now we can see it.
Good. So these were some of the responses that people got, especially the people who were the activists who led this movement. The first one, for example, says, activism is not synonymous to gangsterism. To be taken serious as an activist, you need to look responsible. Conformity to the norms and values of society. By merely looking at this video, no responsible parent will allow their daughter into Arewa Me Too. And the video they're referring to is the video of Miriam Awesu, who was one of the activists who championed the Arewa Me Too movement. And because she was wearing a nose ring, she was mocked for not conforming to societal values of what decency was supposed to be. And because of that, they tried to use this mockery to dislodge the entire conversation about Arewa Me Too movement. There were also, for example, responses like, I know a lot of women in remote villages, in remote areas and villages, and most of the ladies here twittering are too smart to be the victims. They took themselves to the spoiled rich men, and when they're dumb, they become feminists. Arewa Me Too movement is a hoax. So most of the response, especially from the male gender, was about dislodging the conversation by mocking the activists or mocking the movement itself. This last one, it's a picture which is supposed to portray the fact that women were not dressing Islamically, and because they were not doing that, this is the reason why they would subject themselves to abuse. And so this is, for me, one of the vivid examples of how people using social media can dislodge identity-based conversations online using mockery. Helena, it's back to you.
Thank you, Medinat. That was such an interesting response, and kind of zooming into that particular aspect of the expression of identity online, and the way you contextualized it. I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask you for that screen share back. So I think you need to escape
to
and
stop
hit.
Sharing, yes.
Yeah, that's the one. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to talking about another area of this idea about identity and online expression. And this is actually, you know, the reflection, the next reflection, which is about the link in between online and offline, is, can you see my screen? I think you should be able to, but just checking. Okay, I'm going to assume that's a yes. Yes, okay, you can see my screen. This, you know, this is inspired by the fact that we often get this question asked. We often get asked, okay, fine, so people are expressing these identities online, but you know, essentially, does that matter? Is it really relevant to what is happening offline, to the conflict context offline? And you know, it's so hard to decipher that. It's so hard to really understand what is this link between online identity formation and what is happening offline in any context, whether it's in the United States or in Spain, in my own country, or in Nigeria. I'm so interested to see what Medinats is going to say about this, or in other places where we've done this kind of work. But we've got three kind of reflections that I think are interesting. The first one is to really think about which direction causality runs. So when people ask about the link between online and offline, what they're often thinking is people inciting violence online and then that resulting in offline violence. And yes, maybe some of that happens, but it's probably much more common in the other direction. So it's probably much more common that online discourse about identities amplifies or intensifies offline behavior. So for example, where there is already a lot of offline rhetoric about a particular identity and a lot of hate speech, then it moves online, and the online medium provides a cover for more extreme expressions of identity, because it's a medium where there's a certain degree of anonymity, or if not actual anonymity, at least some distance, right? Or another example might be that an offline experience that was already polarizing or was already about, creating a sort of a positioning of a certain identity, is amplified and intensified when it's recounted online and shared online. So something that maybe would have been a minor issue becomes massively amplified and intensified through the online medium. So I think that's quite interesting, because I think people are mostly looking in one direction. They're like, okay, somebody called for an act of violence on Facebook and then it happened offline. And actually it goes back and forth a lot more. And I think that's quite important to keep in mind. And I'm not even sure that the question about causality matters. It's more about understanding this complexity of the discourse. The second thing is that it's not just, it's important to think about the online-offline link, but there's also an online-online link if you want. And specifically, we think that there is likely a link between online identity formation and the spread of misinformation. What do I mean by this? The reason why misinformation is such a challenge is precisely because social media is so entwined with identity. Cognitive bias is all about identity. And that's the reason that cognitive bias is the reason why people believe and spread fake news, right? So misinformation is only really a problem when it gets spread, when it goes viral. And it goes viral because people believe it on face value. And that happens because there is a certain cognitive bias. And that cognitive bias is really entwined with identity, and we think especially with online identities. So again, we don't have any hard evidence of this. We've seen instances of it. It's a question we're asking, and I'd love for Medinat to give us her opinion on that. And then the third one, which we're so sorry, Medinat, I just have one more, and then it's all you again. The third one, which we're so hesitant about that I've even just put it as a question mark, is whether to a certain extent we're flattening our identities online and getting stuck in positions, and that's becoming intrinsic not just to our online identities but just to our identities in general. So I think we've been asking for a while whether the use of digital technologies, and particularly the use of social media, is fundamentally shaping the human experience in some profound way. If you think about it, what's the incentive to go online? It's a desire for engagement, right? And it's easier to do this. It's easier to get more engagement with simple identities. We all know this. And that can be playful, right? The simplifying of our identities, it's what memes are about. It's what jokes online are about. You can all think of instances where you've done that. So to a certain extent, when we play on social media, when we go online seeking engagement, we're simplifying our identities, we're flattening our complex identities. And the longer we spend online, perhaps the more we get siloed and the more we position, the more positions we take to make our identities easier to read online. even when we don't mean to in any negative way, when we're just being playful, right? And so it seems to me like there's a limited appetite to enter into uncomfortable spaces and conversations online. And because there's that limited appetite, it might be that in the way that we're behaving on social media, we're all to a certain extent creating more of a ground for polarization. Okay, so those are the 3 thoughts, and I'm gonna stop sharing and hand it back to Medinat. It's all yours.
Thanks again, Helena. And I totally agree with you to say that's the point where we are right now, especially with social media and the physical anonymity and the distance that it creates for people to be expressive without borders. Then causality really, it's not like it's not important, but much more as we go on, causality doesn't play a prominent role anymore. And I'm going to give you 2 examples from Nigeria of how, for example, online discussions fueled an offline behavior, and the other example where offline behavior fueled an online discussion and vice versa. The first one actually is going to be something that happened quite recently, where a hashtag was formed for the Boko Haram insurgency. Of course, everybody must have heard about the Boko Haram insurgency and all of the impact that it has had in Nigeria. But very, very recently, about 4 days ago actually, a hashtag started to trend on Twitter, and the hashtag was Stop Kanuri Boko Haram. Stop Kanuri Boko Haram. Why did it start, you would say? Everybody knows Boko Haram to be the deadliest terrorist group in Africa right now. But adding Kanuri to the hashtag was supposed to, in some way, use the linguistic identity marker to mark a terrorist group, and in this way, generally start to spread some kind of hate speech with on Kanuri people and invoke reaction on social media or about Kanuri people. I'm again going to share my screen for you to see some of the kind of tweets that people tweeted using this hashtag. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. So, for example, Kanuri Boko Haram is not leaving because they're playing games with Nigerians and our innocent, helpless citizens. We demand unreserved apology from the Kanuris. They must stop killing other Nigerians now. Truth be told, this is not a northern problem for the North to solve. It is for the Kanuris to tell us the truth and apologize to the rest of Nigeria, and it will stop. What is going on in Borno and Nigeria is an attempt by the Kanuris to dominate the rest of the country. There is no such thing as Boko Haram or ISWAP as an Islamic sect. And this for me is really unbelievable, because this is an insurgency that has killed more than 30,000 people and has rendered over 2.7 million people displaced. And reducing this insurgency to an attempt by a specific linguistic or language group to take over Nigeria is, for me, simplistic and a bit ignorant, I would say. This is an insurgency where the country is still trying to grapple with all of the effects, and they're right now using something that is happening offline to encourage online discussion and investigation, and then encourage online discussion about this in order to, for example, get some kind of either not sympathy, in my opinion, because this is hate speech in the context of the Nigerian cyberspace. So this is an example of how, in some instances, offline discussions can fuel online activity. The last example I want to give is how an online discussion can fuel offline activity and vice versa. This one has to do specifically with the coronavirus. Just hold on, please. This one specifically has to do with the coronavirus, and it's about how religious identity fueled or encouraged the response to the virus. When the first cases were noticed in Nigeria, that was around March, I think, April, most of the state governments started to take in measures, for example, and they started to implement measures that, for example, non-shaking of hands, non-congregation in groups, social distancing measures. But the issues with these social distancing measures were that they were an affront on some Islamic practices. For example, praying in congregation for Muslims, shaking of hands is very, very a vital social interaction tool for Muslims and also for other parts of Nigeria. And so some religious leaders banking on ethnic polarized identities already, banking on religiously polarized identities already, banking on an already divided religious landscape in Nigeria. They started to see these measures as an affront on the practice of Islam and started to encourage their communities and their followers not to agree or not to carry out, not to adhere to any of the social distancing measures. I'm going to show you a video right now of one such religious leader. His name is Malam Said Jinger. He's the head of the Izala movement in Nigeria. He has a very, very large following of people in northern Nigeria, especially in Kano, in Katsina, in Kaduna. And he, one time, said in a very public, he's speaking in Hausa, I will try to translate, and he said in a public forum that as far as is concerned, coronavirus is an attempt at the Nigerian government and the Western powers, especially America, to prevent Muslims from going for Hajj and from practicing their religion. And because of what he said on Twitter, which was largely shared on Twitter, on YouTube, even on Facebook, most of his followers and most people in rural areas in northern Nigeria who believe more in what their religious leaders say because they identify more as Muslims than they identify as Nigerians, most of the people refuse to stay at home, refuse to practice social distancing, refuse to not go to the mosque, continue to engage in congregational prayers, thereby continuing to spread the disease. This was so bad in Kano, for example, even when there were 150 deaths that was being recorded daily because of coronavirus, the government still didn't think that it was necessary for them to investigate this because Kano is known as a very conservative and very Muslim state in Nigeria. I'm just going to share now what happened after the Sheikh talked and how his followers responded to this.
amma fa ba sa son aje maka, ba sa son aje a yi tawafi a Ka'aba, ba sa son a yi sa'ayi tsakanin Safa da Marwa. Suwa Amerikawa, me yasa ka faɗa haka Alhaji Sani? A'a, Trump ne ya kai ziyara ƙasar mamlakatin arabiyyatu Saudiya, sai aka nuna masa ana tawafi a Ka'aba, sai ce wannan abu dole a tsaye da shi, aje a bincika ya faɗa. Ba sa son aje maka, ba sa son aje a yi tawafi.
So what he's basically saying here is that this whole thing about coronavirus is just because they don't want us to go to Mecca to perform the pilgrimage. And then just after, this is what his followers began to Yes. So most of his followers in the last video decided to say, Malama said there's no coronavirus and we believe him, and so we're not going to adhere to anything that he says. Most of these videos for people who were not in Kano, for Izala followers who were not in Kano, or even for Muslims who were not in Kano, was shared on social media, especially on Twitter, on YouTube, and on Facebook. And this galvanized non-adherence to most of these social distancing measures that were put in place in order to curb the pandemic. This just shows, like I said, that there are instances where causality does not matter, whether it's offline or online. There's a lot of interactions that is going on where offline discourses can be amplified by online discussions, and in the end, influence behavior both online and offline. But more important is for us to know that identity markers can be used online or offline to influence either offline or offline behavior. Thanks, and back to Helena.
Thank you, Medinat. that was so interesting and just so on point with all the different examples and connecting it also to the current situation of the pandemic. I found that incredibly insightful. We have one last round of reflections going, and I've just realized that I completely neglected to see if there were any questions from the audience. So maybe we'll just take them at the end instead of doing them throughout as I had originally said. I think I was just too caught up in all the things that Medinat is sharing. So the last piece of insights or reflections that I wanted to share it will be a little bit shorter, so I'll do it quite quickly. But essentially, we've been trying to figure out how much of this issue of online identity formation has to do with the environment of social media in particular, and how that environment is affecting our behavior. Not to say that the expressions of identity aren't deliberate, of course that they are, but as I said in the previous set of reflections, we have a sense that the environment itself is shaping our human experience. And so one of the things that we've been trying to understand is what features of social media, what affordances of social media, if you like, are most impacting the way we express, share, and form our identities online. And the reason that I think this is important is that this also points to, if we're going to do as peace builders an intervention on social media, what does that intervention need to target? What kind of behavior? So we ran a poll, and it was obviously fairly limited, but it was among people who were attending the Stockholm Forum. So sort of people who I would say are probably thinking about these issues quite deeply. And this is what came out. So perhaps unsurprisingly, what people say most affects our behavior as it relates to online identity formation is the nature of algorithms. So what content users see depending on their behavior online, the fact that you're presented with things that are similar to what you have liked before and often more extreme, so that the algorithms tend to push in that direction because they're looking for engagement. Closely behind that was the issue of virality, so how content can be shared and forwarded, and the options that are available to react to content. And then also kind of having some kind of an impact was the idea of micro-targeting, so how content is shared via advertisements for particular segments of the population. I think that's quite interesting because it does mean that different people get presented with different slices of reality, if you want. And then the possibility of posting anonymously, so fake profiles. That one surprised me. It's not something that I've thought of as being that important, but I think that's probably a practice in certain places a lot more. And then issues around content moderation, interestingly, came out as the least important of the ones that we were looking at. And I think that might have to do with the fact that content moderation is quite limited. So the policies that platforms have on how to moderate content, number one, they're relatively limited, especially in places with languages that platform administrators have more trouble with. And number two, they're quite difficult to monitor. So I thought that was quite interesting. So that's the final set of reflections. And Medinat, I'd love to know your reactions to that.
Fairly quickly, I think in the Nigerian context, the major features of social media, which encourages most of the conversations that we've talked about identity polarization, first has to do with the democratizing potential that social media has. The fact that it gives rights to everybody. The fact that, for example, it allows people to bypass the normal or traditional information gatekeepers in Nigeria is the reason why I think everybody wants to come on social media. The distance, of course, that it guarantees as an interface tool is also very, very vital. And the fact that it also guarantees physical anonymity. In the Nigerian context, I think the ones that are really, really connected are the virality we talked about, the fact that it also is provoking reactions, and the anonymity that it guarantees. And of course, these points are very, they're not endemic to the same situation in different contexts, whether, for example, it's on Arawa Me Too or it's on Boko Haram, then the specificity of which of these features makes it attractive is different. I would stop here so we can take questions.
Thanks so much, Medinat. Why don't we both keep our videos on now so that there's a face to the questions they're asking too. And Julie just posted in the chat a reminder that if you have any questions, then you can start adding them now. Arpit, you're asking whether you should write those questions in the Q&A section. That would be great. Yes. I believe you all have a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. So you can put them in there and then we'll see them. And if anybody's watching on Facebook, then Julie will be looking at the comment thread as well, so she can pick them up from there. So while we wait for some of the questions to come in, I just want to thank Medinat again for this. It's made me even more excited about your keynote at Build Peace. And I'll just take the opportunity to say that if any of you want to attend Build Peace in person or on the online format, the registrations are open on the website. Julie can post the web address in a second. It's a donation-based conference, which means that in order to attend, you just make a donation in accordance to your ability, and that helps us make sure that we can run the conference. So, any questions? Oh, there is a question. So Arpit is asking a question that I'm going to pass straight on to you, Medinat. He's saying,
I can see that.
He's saying, how could online discussion solve the problem of radical terrorism?
So I think, for example, in the context of, I always would bring it back to the Nigerian context because that is where I am an expert. There's not been a lot of recruitment by radical groups using a lot of social media or online platforms. It's just recently that, for example, ISWAP, which is the breakaway faction from Boko Haram, has been known to, for example, publicize either their killings or their attacks using the ISIS, actually using ISIS social media platforms. And it's actually much more recently, 2 or 3 years ago, that Abubakar Shekau, the head of the Boko Haram group, has been known to be very viral, to be very vibrant with his use of YouTube. And so in the Nigerian context, it's not still a very, very veritable tool for radical terrorism. Social media is still not happening. It is happening on a low scale, but it's not like in other contexts. There's still much more recruitment that is going on, if there's any, right now, much more physically or forcefully in the Nigerian context. But it still doesn't mean that there are no ways that we can stop this. For me, and I think we had this discussion, if Lisa Shirk is still online, at the last conference, when we took, Elena, you were there, when we argued about the fact that if we decide that people, social media platforms need to regulate their content based on what people put inside of it, we do not have the power to do this. So the discussion about whether we can stop radical terrorism, I don't think it's going to happen online. I think it has to be more of an offline discussion that would now be amplified through online activism or online activities or discussions. But we do not, for example, have the power to tell Facebook or to tell Twitter. Yes, now they do a lot of regulation of what they consider as hate speech or what is fake news and all of that. But the places and the context and the ways that most of the conversations or most of the tweets or most of the chats on Telegrams, the ways that they coin the discussions, you would not even realize that this is a form of radical terrorism, that it's an act of recruitment to radical terror. You wouldn't know that this is it. The contexts are too varied, the languages are too different, the ways of communication are multifaceted, that we cannot rely only on the social media platforms to do this for us. So I would think that the most important way will be for us to start offline discussions, offline engagement, offline activism, we don't just talk about the government needs to provide all of the stuff for them to fix the social contract. We know all of that. We already know that for the youth, they need jobs. We know all of that. But the conversation online alone would not prevent radical terrorism, depending on what context you're in. The Nigerian context, definitely.
Thanks, Medinat. That was really, really interesting. I'm going to take the next one, but I'm just warning you that the third question is all yours because it's specifically about Nigeria. So you can start reading it while I answer the next one. So there's a question from Ian Hunter that said, do either of you see targeted advertisements as playing a role in forming online identities So Ian, that's a really interesting question. And it is something that we've thought about a fair amount of build up through some of the projects that we do. I think the issue with targeted advertisements, particularly when it's targeted political advertisements, is that they essentially segment political discourse differently for different people according to their demographic characteristics or their ideologies, their existing ideology. And by doing that, you increasingly make it hard to find common ground because you're sharing the same messaging, but with different slants and different perspectives of reality with different groups of people. So it becomes harder and harder to find common ground and to essentially have a common identity at the national level. I think that that's something that that is quite evident, for example, in the way that political discourse plays out in the United States. We have a program in the United States that looks to intervene on social media to try and essentially have conversations that are finding common ground. And one of the things that is very evident to us is that people are operating in these online silos. A lot of that has to do with targeted advertisement. There's actually a fair amount of research on this phenomenon. And particularly on this, one of the things that I think is most pernicious is this practice of sniper targeting, where they essentially target down to very, very small audiences. So it's not just micro targeting; it's even smaller, and then deliver very slightly different messages to different groups of people. So I think that is critical in the forming of identities, and particularly in the division of identity and the inability to form a common identity. Medinat, do you want to tackle the next one on the positive examples?
Exactly, yes. I would say yes, definitely. There's been numerous
Hang on,
examples.
because, sorry, the participants can't see it. So I'm going to read what the question was.
Oh, okay.
So there was a question, yeah. So there was a question about whether there have been any positive examples of online identity formation in Nigeria that could be used as inspiration for addressing some of the polarization challenges that you talk about. Yeah,
exactly. I agree. I for example, there has been the first one I would use would be the Make Kajuru Work Again. Kajuru is one of the currently, apart from Boko Haram, I don't know if you also know that there is an ongoing it's not they don't want to call it, they don't want to identify it as a kind of terrorism going on, but in northwest Nigeria right now there is a farmer header conflicts that is leading to a lot of banditry attacks, which is coming to look like a non-state armed groups operating there. And Kajuru is one of the areas that has been affected by this. And of course, they would try to online make a discussion about it's Fulani attacking Hausas, or Hausas attacking minority groups, and Kajuru is one of the minority groups. And one of the ones that came up, one of the really online identity formation that came up was when Kajuru people actually started to use this hashtag called Make Kajuru Work Again. And they started to highlight, for example, all of the problems that they had gone through under this Northwest banditry attacks, to show that we are also suffering these attacks with you. And it's not like it's us against them, as in it's kind of identity. We are all in this problem together. And it is high time that we stop to use linguistic ethnic markers by ourselves to divide context that we see this conflict. And maybe when we do this is when we find solutions. Maybe when we're able to go after all, forget about this kind of identity markers is the only opportunity that we'll have to come together, Fulanis, Hausas, Kajurus, and be able to solve this problem. And I think that I don't know, I cannot say it worked, but I think it created an understanding online, especially, that it's not everybody who subscribes to identity divisions and identity polarization, that there are actually people on these same social media platforms who know what is right and are willing to talk about better solutions that do not involve ethnic or linguistic identity markers, or that do not involve any kind of polarization. So I totally agree that we can use the same tools that are creating this kind of identity polarization to actually bridge this identity polarization. It just needs a lot of understanding of the context and applying the right tools to the different contexts that emerges.
Thanks, Medinat. That was a really interesting answer. And I think actually, because it's somehow related, I want to go to a question that actually came in from a watcher on Facebook. And she said, how are peace builders allowing for identities to grow full and complex again? If connecting polar opposite parties is not an option, could de-escalation happen by allowing people to realize other shared identities or other aspects of self? I think this is a really interesting question and also suggestion of what peace-building action on social media could look like. And I'm going to take this one because it relates very closely to something that we're starting to practice at Build Up. So we have a program in the USA that I mentioned a minute ago, and another one in collaboration with 6 universities in Western Kenya. And both of them are essentially providing resources and support to people on social media who want to depolarize conversations. And one of the ways that we're finding that depolarization works in social media conversations is by providing a space where people can explore the complexity of identity. And one of the specific ways that that happened when we ran this program last year in the USA was that facilitators would not, they do 2 things. One is they wouldn't directly challenge a polarized position or an opinion. They would simply say, they would reflect on the fact that that was a position that tended to be polarized, or that might be the result of being in a bubble. They would ask whether the other person felt that they were being heard when they expressed that opinion. And they would share quite openly what their identity is, including identity markers that would make it obvious that they probably didn't have that position or opinion, but they still wanted to hear the other. It's essentially an attempt at practicing non-judgment and listening, which are the core skills of nonviolent communications in social media. And it's very difficult because if any of the people on this webinar, if you've used nonviolent communications, it's quite a nuanced and complex technique for dialogue, for in-person dialogue. So to translate that into a practice on social media has been quite challenging, but that's what we're trying to do in these 2 programs. And so I would say, obviously, that's just one example and one possible response about how peace builders can allow for identities to grow full and complex again, specifically on social media. But I think it's one that we're hoping to continue to explore more. So that would be my answer to that one. We've got a couple more questions. So Medinat, would you, there's a question from Arpit Sharma, who is saying, what are the other polarization related problems that can be solved through online discussion? Would you like to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I think my first answer, or my basic answer to that, would be stigmatization. There is a lot of stigmatization of people, of groups, of just people based on just what people talk about them on social media. So much that when you, for example, as an individual, meet this group of people off social media, becomes a bit impossible for you to match what you've heard or what you've seen going on social media about them with the reality on ground. The first example that comes to mind would be the use of the word aboki. I shouldn't talk about this because this is a very integral part of the keynote, but I'm just gonna talk about it quickly. The use of the word aboki to describe most Hausa people. The word itself is a derogatory word. And it conveys, for example, to people, they use it every time online when they want to talk about something that is negative and relates to the Hausa linguistic group or the Fulani linguistic group. You see other people use the word aboki to refer to them. And it basically just says that they are illiterate. They are, for example, they do not know how things are going on. So when, for example, a Hausa person says something really ridiculous to you and you want to really demean the person, you say, please, aboki, you don't know what you're saying. And this stigmatization makes a lot of people from the south of Nigeria, from the east of Nigeria, to assume that every Hausa person is either an illiterate or somebody who does not understand, so much that when they meet a Hausa or a Muslim, more importantly, a Hausa or a Muslim offline, then it becomes a bit difficult for them to either judge them based on the offline appearance or offline behavior, because you're already construed with this assumption that every Hausa person is illiterate, or every Hausa person does not know what is happening. And to start with, not all Hausa people are Muslims. Not all Hausa people speak Hausa. There are a lot of northern people who do not speak Hausa as a language. But these conversations online already stigmatize every Muslim Hausa person as this. And I think that this is one of the problems that we can solve with online discussion. Yes, back to you, Lisa. Sorry, I see a comment here from Lisa Shirt. You want to take that, Helena?
I think we may be out of time.
Yes, but
it's a great comment. Do you want to just read it out, Julie, as a closing statement?
Yeah, I'll read it out, and this will be food for thought, Lisa, as we continue the discussion. So Lisa's called in, the issue I struggle with is that polarization has been an important positive element of most social justice movements. Here in the US, Black Lives Matter is polarizing in that it creates a clear pull for what is just. Denouncing racism and identifying racist action is part of identity formation. What are your thoughts about setting human rights norms through social media speech acts that have the impact of emphasizing us-them identity narratives? Okay, oh, that's tempting not to say.
I know, what a great comment to end on. Lisa, we could do a whole other webinar on that, so maybe that's what we should do. It's definitely been a conversation internally at Build Up. How do we do anti-racism and depolarization together? And I'm seeing Medinat nodding lots. So maybe we just need another conversation. Julie, which is possible because we have webinars.
Yes, perfect. So closing out today, I want to thank you, Elena and Dr. Malefakis. Oh, I just mispronounced your name. Sorry, Medinat, for your conversation here today. It was really interesting. You can see a recap, a recording of this conversation that we will post on our webinar page. I've just put the link there. And you can always check there for upcoming events, which we'll have to schedule another follow-up to tackle this one in specific. As Elena mentioned, the How to Build Peace Conference has this theme as a sub-theme. So if you haven't yet registered or checked that out, you can still apply to contribute to that conference through July 31st. And that link has been posted up earlier in the chat as well. So thank you both so much for your conversation. And we hope to see many of you again in these other forums.
Thank you.